Chapter 4. Understanding Left Pessimism. In between his videos on suicidal ideation, self-harm, and childhood trauma, Matt Thoughtslime decided to explain their analysis of modern capitalism. When exactly do you think capital will be done making money? How much money is enough for the ultra-rich jackasses who already have most of it? We've long ago sailed past it, because several of them own incalculable sums. So much that they could not spend it in 1,000 lifetimes, and yet they don't stop. Despite the consequences, the human cost, the environmental cost, they keep going. There are only so many resources to be extracted from the earth until there aren't any left. They keep going forever, or more realistically, until they can't. And at that point, we are doomed. A human being intuitively understands that growth cannot continue forever. We understand the concept of finite resources. We, the consumer, particularly those of us in the West, bear some responsibility in this too. We buy shit we don't need, and throw away shit other people could use. The degrowth delusions. This view is inherently opposite of Marx's view. In Matt's view, the problem is not that capitalism is holding back human progress and creativity, but rather that it is unleashing it. Like a neoliberal economist, Matt Thoughtslime believes the delusion that somehow the system that leaves millions of people in poverty across the developing world and increasingly drives first world workers into greater poverty and lower living standards is not holding back human productivity. Like a free market economist, Matt Thoughtslime believes capitalism is capable of creating endless growth, something the last 200 years of economic crises, wars, and chronic poverty despite technological advancement has clearly refuted. While Matt accepts the premise that capitalism is capable of creating endless growth, Matt thinks this is bad. In their video championing degrowth, Thoughtslime argues that humans have gone too far. The problem isn't that working people are increasingly impoverished due to capitalism's inherent creation of poverty amidst plenty. The problem is that average working people have too much stuff. As American workers are seeing their wages go down, their homes foreclosed, and their children condemned to a life of student debt, the problem is that they are still too comfortable. Thoughtslime anticipates an ecological apocalypse unless human consumption can be urgently reduced. Matt insists their degrowth model is not the same as capitalist austerity. This perspective is certainly not new. In 1972, a capitalist think tank based in Italy called the Club of Rome published a document called The Limits to Growth. Jimmy Carter's White House published a document called the Global 2000 Report, making similar claims. This has been the worldview of many of the wealthiest and most powerful capitalists for a long time. In 1798, British economist Robert Malthus published an essay on the principle of population, arguing that the birth rate naturally outstrips the food supply, and measures must be implemented to stop peasants and workers from breeding. The Rockefeller family was heavily involved in the Neo-Malthusian Society, sponsoring the Birth Control League and pushing for the legalization of abortion and contraception. It is the biggest capitalists, namely those associated with the free trade theories of Adam Smith and the British Empire, that have pushed degrowth. They sit at the top of the world and do not want to lose their position. Human history and progress must be ended so they can remain permanently in their winning position. The world must remain poor and get poorer, so that they can stay rich. The imperialist wars of the last 70 years have largely been degrowth operations. Millions were killed in Vietnam and Korea in the hopes of preventing these countries from industrializing with socialist economies. Iraq and Libya, who had used state-run oil resources to fund industrialization and development, have been reduced to poverty and chaos. China and Russia are hated by the Western imperialists because they are no longer impoverished client states, but competitors selling their own oil, steel, and computer technology in competition with the monopolists. Human progress has gone too far. Stop it! Scream the Wall Street ultra-rich from the boardrooms of J.P. Morgan Chase, ExxonMobil, and Bank of America. Not only must the developing world remain poor, they proclaim, but living standards must also drop in the West. The industrial middle class that once made Western imperialist homelands so stable must be reduced to lower living standards. Marxists have always opposed and dissected this fallacious logic. Friedrich Engels described Malthus's concept of overpopulation as the crudest, most barbarous theory that ever existed, a system of despair which struck down all those beautiful phrases about love thy neighbor and world citizenship. In Theories of Surplus Value, Marx wrote, Malthus's theory of value gives rise to the whole doctrine of the necessity for continually rising unproductive consumption, which this exponent of overpopulation, because of shortage of food, preaches so energetically. This theory, for its part, suits his purpose remarkably well, an apologia for the existing state of affairs in England, for landlordism, state and church, pensioners, tax gatherers, tenths, national debt, stock jobbers, beadles, parsons, and menial servants. Malthus also wishes to see the freest possible development of capitalist production, however only insofar as the condition of this development is the poverty of its main basis, the working classes. But at the same time he wants it to adapt itself to the consumption needs of the aristocracy and its branches in state and church, to serve as the material basis for the antiquated claims of the representatives of interests inherited from feudalism and the absolute monarchy. Malthus wants bourgeois production as long as it is not revolutionary, constitutes no historical factor of development, but merely creates a broader and more comfortable material basis for the old society. In his economic notebooks, Marx showed how Malthus's conceptions of unproductive consumers were completely false, but served the interests of the wealthy people who had commissioned his work. Marx wrote, Malthus's book On Population was a lampoon directed against the French Revolution and the contemporary ideas of reform in England, Godwin, etc. It was an apologia for the poverty of the working classes. The theory was plagiarized from Townsend and others. His essay on rent was a piece of polemic writing in support of the landlords against industrial capital. Its theory was taken from Anderson. His Principles of Political Economy was a polemic work written in the interests of the capitalists against the workers and in the interests of the aristocracy. Church, tax eaters, toadies, etc., against the capitalists. Its theory was taken from Adam Smith. Where he inserts his own inventions, it is pitiable. What is the inherent flaw regarding the logic of limited resources? This logic fails to take into account that the way human beings interact with resources has constantly been in a state of change. Across Africa, Minerals are being extracted and sold at high value currently, when just several decades ago they were worthless. Computer chip technology has rendered them very valuable. The long-predicted peak oil scenario, in which petroleum would run out causing a global catastrophe, never panned out, because new methods of extracting oil, from deep-sea drilling to hydraulic fracking, have been invented. The current fossil fuel economy is certainly unsustainable and creating a global crisis of climate change. But the solution is moving to a more efficient and sustainable energy source, the most promising hope for which is nuclear fusion. For this reason, China and Russia have called for international cooperation for fusion research, and China has announced its intent to mine the rare isotope helium-3 from the moon. The way human beings interact with resources must change, no doubt about it. But the pessimistic notion that the human race must degrow is frightening and unrealistic. As Friedrich Engels noted, the animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends, masters it. This is the final, essential distinction between man and other animals, and once again it is labor that brings about this distinction. Human beings are tool makers and inventors, constantly changing how they interact with their environment, more efficiently forcing it to serve us and expand our life expectancy and quality of being. Marxism seeks for the population to expand and for living standards to rise. In fact, the transition from the lower stage to the higher stage of communism is rooted in the ability of a centrally planned economy to vastly increase the productive forces. In his Critique of the Gotha Program, Marx explained that the ultimate goal of total equality and a stateless, classless world was only possible with vast material abundance. Marx wrote, "In the higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, 'From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.'" Marx was pointing to the fundamental reality that inequality is rooted in scarcity. Class society, the state, oppressive relations, and patriarchy are all rooted in managing a society at a certain level of development. As society has become more abundant and living standards have become higher, the rigidity of less abundant times has somewhat eroded. No one spoke of freedom of speech in ancient times, because such a concept was simply inconsistent with a society at this technological level. Scarcity necessitates authoritarianism and hierarchy, and abundance and development loosen these restraints, creating equality and freedom. Marx brilliantly ripped to shreds the liberal ideology of the Enlightenment, exposing that rights and liberties are not natural and God-given, but rather correspond to the economic base of society. Only by creating a society of vast abundance, totally eradicating scarcity, can total freedom be attained, and only by having rational central planning of the economy can this level of abundance be created. As capitalism holds back technological progress with the irrational creation of poverty amidst plenty and the crisis of overproduction, it prevents humanity from marching toward the ultimate vision of a high-tech classless society of freedom and abundance. Socialism has always been a fundamentally optimistic political movement. It views human history as marching forward from hunter-gatherer civilization to slavery and feudalism to capitalism, with socialism, the lower stage of communism, and the ultimate higher stage of communism on the horizon. This understanding of the state, hierarchies, and the progressive trajectory of humanity towards great abundance is what makes Marxist historical materialism so valuable. In an age where right-wing figures like Jordan Peterson argue that hierarchies and inequality are just natural, it is essential to understand human social structures as reflective of an underlying economic base. As the underlying economic base changes, human relations also change. The family, the nature of government, the level of freedom and social mobility is not rooted in some natural way found in our DNA or created by divinity. These institutions have evolved throughout human history as human beings moved toward a greater state of material abundance. BreadTube obscures this and furthermore denounces human progress and technological advance, thus feeding the common right-wing delusions. The agenda of the ultra-rich proclaiming that human progress must be stopped has repeatedly been inserted into the socialist movement. In the process of Bonapartism, in which capitalists utilize workers as their foot soldiers in a struggle to stabilize the capitalist economy utilizing the state, various pessimistic counter-gangs have been formed in order to hijack the passion and activism of those who would be revolutionaries. Georges Sorel's birth strike. The French philosopher Georges Sorel was the first prominent leftist voice to break with this optimism, long considered essential in the socialist movement. Sorel wrote in his 1908 pamphlet, Reflections on Violence. It seems to me that the optimism of the Greek philosophers depended to a great extent on economic reasons. It probably arose in the rich and commercial urban populations who were able to regard the universe as an immense shop full of excellent things with which they could satisfy their greed. I imagine that Greek pessimism sprang from poor warlike tribes in the mountains, who were filled with an enormous aristocratic pride, but whose material conditions were correspondingly poor. They explained their present wretchedness to them by relating catastrophes in which semi-divine former chiefs had succumbed to fate or the jealousy of the gods. The courage of the warriors might for the moment be unable to accomplish anything, but it would not always be so. The tribe must remain faithful to the old customs in order to be ready for great and victorious expeditions, which might very well take place in the near future. Sorel openly attacked the concept of optimism, and his thought influenced the syndicalist current in Europe. He broke with much of the Marxian tradition and outlook. The primary difference that Sorel had with the French Marxists and Social Democrats was their belief in building a mass organization. Sorel argued that instead of building a broad organization among the working class with roots in unions, community groups, and such, it was instead better to build a group of fanatical, dedicated men who would engage in heroism through acts of violence. Sorel invoked the power of mythology in building effective mass movements, and drew heavily from the history of Greece and Rome when arguing how to build an ideal revolutionary organization to overturn capitalism. At the time of his death in 1922, Georges Sorel was an enthusiastic admirer of both Vladimir Lenin and Benito Mussolini. Sorel believed that both Lenin's Party of New Type and Mussolini's Black Shirts proved that his model of a violent, heroic counter-gang, as opposed to a mass party, was effective. While no record of contact between Lenin and Sorel can be established, the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini was heavily influenced by Sorel's teachings. Mussolini had been the editor of a socialist newspaper in Italy, but he broke with Marxism and became a syndicalist and adherent of Sorel's teachings while living in Switzerland in 1902. Eventually, Mussolini formed the Fascist Party in 1919, synthesizing the teachings of Georges Sorel with the theories of Italian futurist Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Plato, among other influences. However, he made it clear, "I owe most to Georges Sorel. This master of syndicalism by his rough theories of revolutionary tactics has contributed most to form the discipline, energy, and power of the fascist cohorts." Mussolini's blackshirt gangs seized control of Italy and established the fascist state at the famous March on Rome in October of 1922. The Spanish Phalangist, the fascist movement led by Francisco Franco that ruled Spain from 1939 to 1975, is also rooted in Sorel's syndicalism. Franco and his allies were originally members of the National Syndicalist Party of Spain, a group of Sorelians who supported the Spanish monarchy, arguing that mystical power of the throne could be used to mobilize the working class. Taking lead from Sorel, Mussolini and Franco utilized anti-capitalist demagogy, but wrapped it in pessimism, looking backward to the supposed glory of archaic monarchies and nationalistic imagery while glorifying violence and destruction. One big aspect of this was opposing the expansion of the human race and embracing the concept of overpopulation. In the lead-up to the First World War, the syndicalists and followers of Georges Sorel began arguing for a birth strike. They argued, in Marxian terms, that having children would drive wages down by increasing competition for jobs. They furthermore argued that revolutionaries should not be upstanding working-class community members, but rather a special elite group of dedicated fanatics who did not have time for the distraction of family life. While the Marxist movement supported the right of women to contraception and abortion, it rejected the birth strike. They understood that believing poverty was due to overpopulation was a fundamental break with Marx's economic teachings. Marx had vehemently argued against the concept of overpopulation, and exposed the demagogy of the originator of this concept, Robert Malthus. When Georges Sorel and his proto-fascist syndicalists proposed the birth strike, this was a component of rejecting Marxism's optimism. It fit in with their reintroduction of organizing methods rooted in mystical chivalry and love of violence, rather than material need and solidarity. More than a century after Sorel wrote, pessimism flows through almost all that the dominant BreadTube voices say and do. In their view, the world is on the brink of collapse unless there can be a reduction of consumption. The population is too large. Technology has advanced too much. The pessimism manifests itself beyond merely the doomsday and hopeless rhetoric. The excessive use of profanity, the celebration of drug use, the endless conversation about suicide and mental illness, the fixation on ugly and grotesque things such as feces, semen, urine, dirt, slime, self-harm, and cathartic violence all fit with this worldview. The fact that Matt, Thought Slime, narrates sarcastic, crude videos which often condemn the concept of economic growth or fixate on mental illness-related topics, while standing in front of the image of a sewer dripping with green slime, may not be an accident. Let us revisit a passage from Malthus's infamous 1798 piece, An Essay on the Principle of Population. All children who are born, beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level, must necessarily perish, unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread this too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. It is also worth noting that Sorelian pessimist and ex-socialist Benito Mussolini shared the fixation on feces and the cruel degrading humor of bullies often found among BreadTube voices. One of Mussolini's favorite ways of punishing dissidents is described in Peter Carlson's 2016 article published on HistoryNet. As Rogers studied Mussolini, he learned about the dictator's favorite disciplinary tool, castor oil. Black shirts would seize a foe, rough him up, strap him to a chair, and pour the laxative down his throat. Once the fellow soiled himself, the black shirts would send him home sick, hurting, and humiliated. The article describes how mainstream U.S. media radio personality Will Rogers found this demented practice to be humorous, and joked about it with the murderous fascist dictator while they bonded over Russophobia. Rogers found this stratagem hilarious. "I know of nothing that would lessen a man's political aspiration more than this," he wrote. "Just think of the possibilities not only in Italy, but in our country." Delighted that an American appreciated his torturous innovation, Mussolini elaborated, "One fellow, he not so bad, we give him half-liter," he said, laughing. "Next fellow, he bad boy, we give him 1 liter. Rogers asked Mussolini to sell him the recipe so he could dose U.S. senators engaging in filibusters. Congressmen were not so bad, Rogers added, so he'd give them only half a liter. The two men laughed. Rogers said he was going to Russia. "Oh, Russia," Mussolini said. "You take recipe to Russia. Very good for Russia, castor oil. I give you free." And they laughed again. The pessimism also fits with another theme in Sorel's ideology, which is the power of myth. While Marxists focused on seizing power, the syndicalists rejected politics, favoring only direct activism on the job between workers and employers. Syndicalists argued that a great general strike, in which all the workers of the world refused to work and seized their factories, would end capitalism in one big dramatic battle. Sorel's writing argued that while this glorious apocalypse was unlikely to actually happen, the myth of it would inspire great revolutionary activism. In essence, Sorel foreshadowed the eventual emergence of postmodernism, saying truth does not really matter and that ideas, feelings, and narratives are more important than objective reality. BreadTube voices generally argue that truth does not exist, and that the only positive role for revolutionaries to play is that of deconstruction, if not outright destruction. This thinking follows the trajectory of anti-Marxist postmodernism, a trend directly linked to the Congress for Cultural Freedom and CIA covert efforts. In the BreadTube perspective, we find echoes of George Orwell's and Ayn Rand's post-World War II middle-class dystopias. In the presented view, all principles which people may give their lives to are merely totalitarian scams. All heroes who people may idealize are hypocrites and demagogues. All statues must be torn down. All states must be smashed. All hope is naive. All passion and love between people is weakness. The individual stands against the world, the rest of the human race, the vulgar mob that would take away his sacred isolation. There is no real vision of a post-capitalist world to strive for beyond start a cooperative pencil factory. So instead, BreadTube voices merely celebrate the libidinal release of tearing down the current world in an explosion of rage. The glory is found in memes such as "punch a Nazi," or taking gleeful pleasure in the suffering of a person deemed to be privileged. One identity politics-oriented group called Black Hammer announced that Anne Frank, the victim of the Nazi Holocaust whose eloquent diary was published in the post-war years, was a Karen. The group has announced it intends to burn copies of The Diary of Anne Frank as a fundraiser for its efforts to build a city in Colorado in which no whites are permitted. Sexual freedom and left pessimism. Sexual frustration seems to be a big component of left pessimism, as its most infamous recruit demonstrates. Margaret Sanger was a primary financial backer of the industrial workers of the world and was a leading figure in the Socialist Party of New York City. Sanger associated with a number of wealthy left-wing intellectuals in New York City in the early years of the 20th century, including John Reed, Emma Goldman, Max Eastman, and Upton Sinclair. Sanger led fundraising efforts to support the strikes of textile workers in New Jersey and eventually launched her own magazine, The Woman Rebel. Sanger was a Marxist, but central in all things was her belief in sexual freedom. Marxism promised to liberate women from patriarchy, and thus create a world of free love, in which sexual desires would no longer be restrained, and this seemed to be the primary appeal of left-wing politics for Margaret Sanger. The slogan frequently used in her publication was, "No gods, no masters," a phrase that remained popular with anarchists. After calling for the assassination of John D. Rockefeller and facing criminal charges for distributing birth control, Sanger fled the United States for Britain in 1914. In Britain, she began to associate with the Neo-Malthusian Society. Charles Vickery Drysdale was the founder of the Malthusian League. The League was comprised of a group of wealthy British people who believed birth control and abortion could reduce the human population. Opinions such as Sanger's Marxism began to fade following the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Soviet Union did not become the free-love paradise of sexual liberation she had hoped for. However, Sanger's new friends in the British Neo-Malthusian Society were fully committed to legalizing birth control and abortion, as well as promoting pornography. The very Rockefeller oligarchs whom she had previously threatened soon gave her financial backing. With her legal troubles conveniently resolved, Sanger returned to the U.S. and established the first birth control clinic in New York City. Sanger denounced Marxism in scathing polemics, announcing that the problem was not capitalism but simply humanity's drive to procreate and expand. Discontented workers may rally to Marxism because it places the blame for their misery outside of themselves and depicts their conditions as the result of a capitalistic conspiracy, thereby satisfying that innate tendency of every human being to shift the blame to some living person outside himself. And because it strengthens his belief that his sufferings and difficulties may be overcome by the immediate amelioration of his economic environment. In this manner, psychologists tell us, neuroses and inner compulsions are fostered. No true solution is possible, to continue this analogy, until the worker is awakened to the realization that the roots of his malady lie deep in his own nature, his own organism, his own habits. To blame everything upon the capitalist and the environment produced by capitalism is to focus attention upon merely one of the elements of the problem. The Marxian too often forgets that before there was a capitalist, there was exercised the unlimited reproductive activity of mankind, which produced the first overcrowding, the first want. This goaded humanity into its industrial frenzy, into warfare and theft and slavery. Capitalism has not created the lamentable state of affairs in which the world now finds itself. It has grown out of them, armed with the inevitable power to take advantage of our swarming, spawning millions. Like most contemporary environmentalists, Sanger concluded that individual workers and the very creative nature of humanity was the problem, not capitalism. As Sanger joined in with the wealthiest capitalists to reduce the human population, she began to espouse genocidal racism, speaking at Ku Klux Klan rallies. Lothrop Stoddard, one of the most outspoken eugenicists and white supremacists of the 1920s, served on the American Birth Control League's national board. In personal correspondence, Sanger talked of the need to cultivate black ministers to promote birth control, and passingly admitted some rather horrific intentions, writing, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members." In 1921, a speech from Margaret Sanger specifically condemned working-class and low-income people for being religious and having many children, proclaiming, "There is no doubt in the minds of all thinking people that the procreation of this group should be stopped." When the Great Depression hit, and mass hunger and starvation took place across the United States, Sanger's former comrades formed hunger marches and unemployment councils demanding economic relief. Chanting, "Work or wages now!" the Communist Party forced the Roosevelt administration to create the Works Progress Administration, Social Security, and unemployment insurance. Sanger doubled down on her position, blaming the economic crisis on overpopulation and condemning efforts to feed the hungry masses. Sanger's book, The Pivot of Civilization, condemned helping the poor, saying that doing so encourages the healthier and more normal sections of the world to shoulder the burden of unthinking and indiscriminate fecundity of others, which brings with it, as I think the reader must agree, a dead weight of human waste. Instead of decreasing and aiming to eliminate the stocks that are most detrimental to the future of the race and the world, it tends to render them to a menacing degree dominant. Planned Parenthood, the successor to Sanger's Birth Control League, often claims that Sanger was not herself a racist, but simply appealed to racism in the hopes of promoting women's right to contraception. Sanger may not have harbored consciously racist views, but she was very openly a Malthusian. She believed the problem was not capitalism, but the working people themselves and their desire to procreate and improve their lives. The goal was not a world of greater abundance and prosperity, but rather some kind of great correction that would kill off the useless eaters and throw the world back into balance. Orgasmic politics. Margaret Sanger's departure from Marxism, trading socialism for sex, follows a common pattern of synthetic leftism. Many deviations from scientific socialism appear intoxicated by a carnal undertone. Rather than seeking a healthy society of sustainable growth and human progress, the goal is a cathartic explosion of destruction and vengeance. At the time feudalism was toppled in Europe, the Roman Catholic Church was obviously a primary target of the emerging bourgeois revolutionaries. However, many of the mercantile capitalists and conspiring rationalists embraced pre-Christian European religions and mysticism rather than science. Pantheism, sun worship, Odinism, and the alchemical tradition was popular among the anti-feudal revolutionaries, who often organized themselves into secret societies like the Freemasons or the Bavarian Illuminati. In the mid-1800s, as the new leisure class of capitalists with a lot of free time was created, a trend rightly called Salon culture came to dominate intellectual circles. A variety of different forms of flim-flam pseudo-intellectual entertainment emerged to alleviate the boredom of the privileged. Freudian psychoanalysis, the occultist teachings of Aleister Crowley, hypnotism, and various spiritualist movements eventually emerged from this cultural trend. Unlike Marxism, these trends all seem to emphasize the importance of the individual, rather than the collective fate of humanity. Furthermore, unlike Marxism, the various occult trends did not predict a transition to a higher stage of civilization, but rather an explosive destruction that would return humans to a state of harmony with nature. In his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud argued that civilization was not a worthwhile endeavor, as the impulse for aggression was natural. Christianity is lambasted for urging, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," which Freud deems impossible, leading to endless guilt and shame. Aleister Crowley told his followers that, "Do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and that through his rituals and counseling, he could help them discover their inner will and true desires so they could be pursued and satisfied. Wagner's Ring Cycle, a series of 4 operas completed in 1874, dazzled audiences throughout Europe. The opera was not for the working class, but for the leisure class. Not surprisingly, Wagner's magnum opus contains similar themes to the revolutionary intelligentsia. The plot and characters were derived from Germanic mythology. The final opera concludes with Brunhilde mourning her slain hero Siegfried, mounting a horse and riding it into his funeral pyre as an act of passionate suicide. The fire then spreads, and the entire world soon bursts into flames in a climactic apocalypse. The natural beauty of the Rhine River is all that remains. The revolutionary intelligentsia, young students and intellectuals drawn to left-wing politics, was and remains heavily stamped by the influence of Salon culture. Many of those who embraced Marxism, socialism, or anarchism were among the same privileged strata where Freud, Crowley, and various charlatans and performers made their rounds. In BreadTube politics, much like 1960s counterculture, one finds a heavy representation of the Salon culture's remnants. The journey of the individual to discover what they truly desire and who they truly are is very much the focus. The fulfillment of sexual desires and liberation from restraints on sexual impulses, as well as impulses toward aggression and resentment against authority, is also central. There is a condescending fascination with primitive cultures, believing they are somehow purer than the modern world corrupted by technology. While efforts to conceal it have largely been successful, the age of information technology has allowed the U.S. public to see more clearly that the occultist, apocalyptic, hypersexual, and pantheist tendencies are very much alive among the ruling elites of American capitalism. U.S. politicians and business elites are part of secret societies, like the Order of Skulls and Bones at Yale, and they gather in nude resorts like the Bohemian Grove. Al Gore and many prominent figures in the Democratic Party received spiritual advice from Marilyn Ferguson, an occult guru based in Southern California who published a bizarre political screed called The Aquarian Conspiracy in 1980. The book calls for a mass spiritual awakening. It lays out an individual process for personal transformation that follows the brainwashing patterns developed by American intelligence agencies, promoting hallucinogenic drugs, hypnosis, and other methods. Ferguson describes California as the center of her conspiracy and lists several CIA-linked academic think tanks such as the Stanford Research Institute as being on board. It was later revealed that the Stanford Research Institute spent decades conducting CIA-funded research into telekinesis and other paranormal beliefs, and was also involved in Project MKUltra, the CIA drug program. The Pessimism, sex obsession, anti-growth politics of BreadTube clearly have deep roots. They are not the personal innovation of Vosh, Thought Slime, ContraPoints, or any other shallow internet personality. But these are not the politics of the working class. These are the politics of the ultra-rich who find amid their splendorous existence that something is missing. They want to dig into their personal psyches, discover and unleash their sexual desires, and fantasize about existing in a more primitive state of being where harmony with nature would mean less restraints on their impulses. They seek to explore the depths of their personalities and perhaps overcome some heavy subconscious guilt that flows from living at the top of a global empire. They seek the thrill of a cathartic explosion that will correct the injustices of the world, putting everything back into balance. Beyond whatever psychological motivations, there are the direct economic ones. The pessimistic politics represent the interests of those who already sit at the top of the world economy. Ultra-monopolists who say growth must end because they are already on top. The oil banking elite sees nuclear power and human progress beyond fossil fuels as a threat to their global order. For them, climate change can only mean that humans have gone too far, and a mass reduction of the population and consumption is needed. The working class, however, in its desire to build and construct, solving problems by driving forward human progress, has a completely different worldview. Unlike the optimistic Marxists who lead China and the Bolivarian countries, BreadTube does not serve the march of humanity toward freedom from the irrationality of greed. In its pessimism and destructive mindset, BreadTube serves imperialism.